I am Isabella Santos, and this is a lecture on learning theory. Learning theory is about how involuntary and voluntary actions make up human behavior, which can be attributed to different types of learning. The world around us and our experiences determine how we respond to different stimuli. Then you can ask yourself the question, what is the cause of a reaction? First, we need to define learning. What does it mean to learn? Learning is any relative permanent change in behavior brought about by experience or practice. There are two main types of learning: classical conditioning and operant conditioning. These two methods of learning differentiate involuntary reactions and voluntary reactions, and they will be talked about further later on. Classical conditioning was discovered by Ivan Parlov, who studied learning. He developed the concept based off the observation that it is possible for one to acquire an additional stimulus known as the conditioned stimulus when it is presented before the unconditioned stimulus. The unconditioned stimulus and response are natural reflexes with no learning involved. A neutral stimulus has no effect on a reaction or response before it is paired with the unconditioned stimulus enough times. The response produced by the conditioned stimulus is the conditioned response and is the same as the unconditioned response. More simply, classical conditioning is learning to perform an involuntary response to a stimulus other than the natural stimulus. So this works in 3 steps. 1. An unconditioned stimulus and unconditioned response are previously established. They are natural, they don't need to be learned. 2. Acquisition occurs when a neutral stimulus is repetitively presented before an unconditioned stimulus. 3. This eventually becomes the conditioned stimulus and produces the same involuntary response. The conditioned stimulus that was the neutral stimulus before produces the same involuntary response that the unconditioned stimulus produced, but the unconditioned stimulus is not required anymore. Here we have an example of classical conditioning. To better understand it. A mother tickles her daughter, which therefore produces laughter and twitching in the daughter. The tickling is the unconditioned stimulus, and the laughter and twitching is the unconditioned response. This is a natural reaction to the tickling. Next, the mother begins to repetitively motion the tickling with her fingers before she actually tickles her daughter. The neutral stimulus is the mother motioning her fingers. Then, after a while, the daughter begins to laugh and twitch when the mother motions the tickling with her fingers before she is actually being tickled. Here the neutral stimulus has become a conditioned stimulus and produces the conditioned response, which is the same as the unconditioned response. So there are 4 principles of classical conditioning. 1. The conditioned stimulus must occur before the unconditioned stimulus. The conditioned stimulus cannot occur after the unconditioned stimulus because it will not produce the same effect. 2. The conditioned and unconditioned stimulus must occur very close in time period. That way, they can be connected to each other and not be thought of separate concepts by the person or organism who is being conditioned. 3. The neutral stimulus and unconditioned stimulus must be paired multiple times before conditioning can take place. They must occur multiple times. That way, the organism recognizes that it is occurring again and again, because if it only occurs one time, it is just seen as another thing in the world that can be ignored. Then 4. The conditioned stimulus must be distinctive and identifiable. This is so that the organism can physically conceptualize that the stimulus is happening. They don't need to think about it too much. The stimulus is present, and therefore it can produce the reaction very simply. Classical conditioning is important to my life because it can help me explain my own behavior. If I evaluate my own behavior, it might be possible to find some classically conditioned behaviors, both positive and negative. I can better understand my own reactions and therefore find more success when trying to change a behavior. Classical conditioning can also be very important to my interactions with others. If I understand the process of classical conditioning, then I have the ability to train animals and interact well with children and other people who surround me in everyday life. I can gain the ability to observe behaviors I had not been aware of before. This knowledge of my reactions can allow me to work on changing or improving myself, and can also eventually help me in parenthood to be aware of child's reactions and can be useful in something as small as understanding why a coworker acts in a certain manner. Now we will move on to operant conditioning, studied by Edward L. Thorndike and B.F. Skinner. Operant behavior can be defined as voluntary actions that are done to operate in the world. And operant conditioning is learning applied to voluntary behavior based off reinforcements, which can be positive or negative, following a behavior that determine if it will occur again. There are two features of operant conditioning described below. The law of effect, which states a pleasurable consequence will cause the action to be repeated, and a reinforcement is a consequence that makes a response more likely. Operant conditioning can be easily controlled by authority or even oneself. It is possible to use reinforcements to change behavior to be more desirable. Positive reinforcements are used with the purpose of conditioning something to happen again, and negative reinforcements discourage behavior. Now we have two examples of operant conditioning. Example 1. A little boy puts all his toys away when he is done playing. The behavior is putting the toys away. He is then rewarded by his mother with a hug and an extra piece of candy. The reinforcement is the hug and the candy. The next time the kid plays with his toys, he puts them away. So therefore, there is a learned behavior, which is putting the toys away. And in example 2, a dog tears up their owner's homework when they are gone. The behavior is the dog tearing up the homework. Then the owner comes home and scolds the dog. The reinforcement is the scolding. Next, the dog no longer tears up paper. There is a learned behavior, which is the dog leaving paper alone. Example 1 uses a positive reinforcement, which is the hug and candy, while example 2 uses a negative reinforcement, which is the scolding. The importance of operant conditioning. Operant conditioning explains a lot of human behavior, though we may not realize it. This type of learning is very important to understand how to treat people in order to carefully manipulate behavior without suffering consequences. Operant conditioning is important to me because I can make my own actions rewarding as well as teach others. This also gives insight on how to work well with groups of people in order to communicate in a civil manner and encourage each other. Operant learning is important to me to make an impact on the world around me. I need to see how to effectively work with others and myself in order to be successful. Both operant and classical conditioning provide insight on how to understand other people. They are helpful to give one knowledge of why people react the ways they do. This learning technique also shows why people are diverse and helps understand how people's learning experiences can differ.